We now have so many different views in the Eurozone on where we should go next that it seems that we are politically really stuck. So we need to find creative ways to push the boundary. Where can we, within the confines of the existing political gridlock, find ways where we can all agree on further reforms?
It's very nice to have Christian Odendahl with us. He is the chief economist of the Centre for European Reform, traditionally located in London, but now they opened an office about 2 years ago in Berlin. This is a turbulent period. We have just seen the French big demonstrations and turbulences on the Paris streets, and it doesn't look as if the European project is on a good path just now. How do you see the situation?
So I think it's not only the European project. I mean, there's no European project in the US, and we have a strange president there. So it seems that there is an underlying frustration among the population, and the question is, of course, why is that? Right? There are two strands. I think one strand is this has to do with the economics. You know, we have for too long followed an economic model that mostly benefits the top and does not benefit enough the bottom half of the population. And others are saying, well, this is not necessarily about economics. This is about values. This is a fight against the open liberal societies that have largely won the day, but there are people who disagree. I think it's hard to separate those two. I think it's both, and in some countries at least, the European Union stands for either one or the other, or sometimes both. And France might be one of those cases, as is Italy, for example, or as we saw with Brexit, is Britain. So
let's focus initially on the economic side of it. Well, we have seen over the last 10, 12 years that the monetary union was not very well equipped to deal with the shocks of the financial crises. Huge tensions emerged between different parts of the European Union, north, south, etc. And we're still living with the legacy of the financial crisis. One issue, of course, which emerged quite strongly is that Germany was a very important agent in the reaction to the financial crisis. And some people would say that it was not a forerunner of pushing towards major EMU reforms to equip ourselves towards a possible further shock which the EU on the economic front might experience.
That's true. So I think one of the mistakes of the founders of the euro was not to realize that when a crisis comes at some point, that the creditor countries, those with the current account surpluses, with a big fiscal surpluses, that those countries are the ones who will be in charge in a way, in charge of solving the crisis. And so it didn't put enough in place to fight a crisis, and then was dependent on basically what Germany was willing to sign up to. And the German economic narrative of the crisis right from the start has been very, very different. Right? It has been one of fiscal on the fiscal side. It has been focusing on competitiveness. Those were basically the two major strands, I would say, on which German thinking relied. In part informed by its own history. Right? I don't want to say that's all wrong, but that was how the crisis narrative started. And I think the job of the German politicians at the time, Angela Merkel and Wolfgang Schäuble in particular, would have been to tell the Germans, okay, this is kind of our narrative, but let's try to expand that narrative and say, okay, this is also a macroeconomic crisis that involves the financial sector, that involves banks. How can we ensure all countries, including our own? So basically changing the narrative. I think that was what was needed at the time, and instead Angela Merkel and Schäuble were comfortable kind of living within the confines of the German narrative, and that of course meant that the policy space was quite restricted, right? And that in the end, all these rescue measures failed only in 2012 when the Eurozone decided, okay, we need a banking union, we need a lender of last resort, we need to lose on the fiscal austerity. All those things that do not really fit into the German narrative, right? Only in 2012 were they ready to do that. And I think the Euro crisis got a bit better from that.
In fact, it looked as if from economists agreed more or less towards on the next steps of the monetary union reforms. The banking union needs an instrument for fiscal stabilization. the other pillars on dealing with the banking and the financial system need to be instated. And I think some people would also say it's very important to the European populations to give a feeling that there is also something done at the social policy level jointly. Now, in all these areas, one has a feeling, not only Germany, but of course also other countries are blocking major reforms. Do you see any possibility that these blockages can be overcome over the next 1 or 2 years?
So I'm a typical German optimist, so I would say yes. No, but it's I think that all sides have the impression that they have done a lot. Right? The Germans, if you ask them, they will say, well, we have done a lot in this euro crisis, to help other countries, and so we have moved, right? Other countries will say the same, we have done a lot of austerity, we have done reforms, now it's your turn. So basically everybody says now it's your turn, right? And this is not the environment in which you can, unblock such a stalemate. So I think the German-French axis is always the most important, because that's our two sides of the narrative. Mm-hmm. The problem is the German-French side is not enough. Right, so you could tell from the paper of the 7 German and French economists who made proposals. You could sense while reading it, okay, this is something that the Italians will never agree to, right? So we now have so many different views in the Eurozone on where we should go next, that it seems that we are politically really stuck. So we need to find creative ways to push the boundary. Where can we, within the confines of the existing political gridlock, find ways where we can all agree on further reforms? I would suggest that one, if you think about the fiscal side, for example, one is to strengthen automatic stabilizers, right? Because that is one of those things where I feel that it does fit into a German narrative. It is one where the fiscal policy in the
and which instrument you would use as a fiscal
that is,
stabilizer?
I don't think that is so important. Whether you could just change the fiscal rules and the fiscal setting to mandate countries to be a lot more counter-cyclical. Mm-hmm. I thought it was really telling that in this German-French document, for example, when they talked about the fiscal rules, their goal was to make them less pro-cyclical. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that shouldn't be the aim, right? If that's all we can aim for, then the Eurozone has had a hard time in front of it.
So people also say that one problem is the legacy, that if you start from different debt and credit positions, it's very difficult to move towards reform, because after all, any further steps are supposed to follow a type of insurance principle, thinking that in the end everybody could be affected by a shock, like Germany was affected in the 90s by a negative shock through unification, and rather rarely in its history had a current account deficit for a short period. And of course, unemployment rates were very high, etc. Yeah. So how do you see this insurance principle could be reestablished as a narrative which could be bought by a wide enough group of countries?
I think the insurance narrative is a strong one, and as you rightly say, the problem is where if everybody starts from the same position, then an insurance policy is a lot easier to sell, right? If they start from very different positions, then it's much harder to sell. This European unemployment insurance reinsurance scheme that the German finance ministry came up with, for example, it's called a reinsurance scheme. It's not an insurance at all, right? Mm-hmm. It's basically a credit line that is just targeted on supporting the unemployed. So even with something like a reinsurance of unemployment insurance scheme, even there we didn't manage to get a proper insurance scheme into that. So I feel that it's extremely difficult unless we have dealt with the legacy issues to really start an insurance scheme, because the countries currently doing well will of course oppose it.
So let me ask you finally on the political side a question. There are political processes going on in all countries, some more worrying than others. But I think the tenor is rather similar, that we find that on the social front we have ignored certain problems which have accumulated through the experience after the financial crisis. They accentuated issues of regional inequality, social inequality, changing job patterns and so on. But the fact is that the political structures have been severely shaken, including in Germany with the AfD, with very different voting patterns in East and Western German regions, also in the south, even in Bavaria, which was such a stronghold of Conservative Party. Do you think these changes in the political landscape are going to be a further blockage, element of blockage in pushing towards some possibilities of pushing a European reform agenda forward?
So I think it does make it a bit more difficult, but you can also sense that parties, centrist parties, are rediscovering Europe as a topic, right? So, for example, in the German case, yes, there's been a decline in the Social Democrats and the Conservative vote share, but the Greens, which are the most pro-European party we have, is surging in the polls to almost 25% in some. So I think this fragmentation of the party spectrum in Germany, for example, and other countries, does open up ways to debate some issues that might have been not debated as much. And I think that is particularly the case for Germany. I think the fact that the Social Democrats in Germany, for example, are declining in vote share to almost 15%, that's not good news, right? Because I think a strong Social Democratic Party is necessary for a proper European
Losing
debate.
the votes mostly to the Greens, no?
In part, one hopes, but that is not necessarily the case.
It goes in both directions.
It goes, unfortunately, in various directions. So I think that for Europe is not good news, because that makes the SPD even more cautious, taking care of its core votership, which is not more progressive on European issues than the Conservatives, right? And so, opening up for the Green, I think the Greens, they are a force to push the European debate, and I think they are doing it, and they're doing it successfully.